Now, if you're familiar with it, they went marching around and marching around and marching around, and what eventually happened is the walls fell. The walls in Jericho came crumbling down. Now, there are two prevalent thought processes on what happened. Now, first, scientists agree, that, yeah, the walls came down because there are archaeological digs in. They found that the walls of Jericho, yeah, they came down. They verified it. It's not like, hey, you guys are just making this up. They just disagree about why the walls came down. Because some scientists, and there's lots of theories, some say that it was, there was earthquake, there was seismic activity, and that happened to generate because they're near a fault line, and that's what made the walls come down. And then you have over here, of course, the Bible people, or Jesus freaks, whatever you want to call them, as we're sometimes called. And even some of those, there's differing theories. Some people say, some of the theologians, people that study the Bible for a living and get paid to do it, they say that there was such a continual shaking of the ground because they marched around for 7 days. You got like 1 million people marching around for 7 days, that weakened the structural integrity of the walls, so that when the horns blew and then the people shouted, the walls came down. And that's, some of the theologians say. Now, there's an actual technical word for both the scientific theory and that particular biblical theory, and it's called baloney. Because there is no scientific evidence that shows that there was seismic activity. And if there was like an earthquake, it wouldn't have just brought down the walls around the city, it would have brought down the buildings in the city. It would have to be some really cool superhero with earthquake powers who directed just the walls to come down, which that would be a cool superpower. And from a theologian, from a biblical standpoint, and I know they say that, it was the marching around, and then the marching did this, and then the yelling, there was this weakened wall, and that's baloney. That's not what happened. The only thing that brought down the walls of Jericho was faith in God to bring down the walls of Jericho. God saying, I am going to do this, but you need to do that. And because the people of Israel were faithful, even though they didn't understand it, even though it didn't make sense, they were faithful, they were also exposed, because remember, this is a city they were coming up against, and the people in the city knew it. So while they're marching around, they didn't have shields, they didn't have weapons, they were open to the people on the walls of the city to just destroy them all. But they were faithful to do what God told them to do, not 1 day, not 2 days, but 7 days just marching around the city, and then faithful when God said shout. That's going to bring down the walls. Makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, but they shouted because they trusted God, and God brought down the walls. If you're not catching what happened, it was Rahab, her brothers, her mother, her father, all of them were brought out. No husband is spoken of, but she later marries Solomon. And they have a son called Boaz. Boaz marries Ruth. How many are familiar with the book of Ruth? Which gives you a little bit of context about how close in time those two accounts were. Boaz marries Ruth, and they have Obed, who has Jesse, who has David, who becomes king, and through his lineage, we get Jesus Christ. So not to, where are all the kids gone? Yeah, not to, go high on the shock through mama scale, but she went from hooker to holiness because of her faith in Jesus Christ. And this is why the author of Hebrews talks about by faith, the walls of Jericho fell. Not by military strategy, not by instrumentation, not by the will of the people, but by faith, the walls of Jericho fell. And by faith, the prostitute Rahab was spared. And not only was she spared, she went from, hooker to holiness to being included in the hierarchy of ancestors of Jesus Christ. And what the author is trying to share with us is that God is able to break down walls and to redeem lives if we are willing to put our faith and our trust in him. And there are lots of walls in our nation that need to come down now. There's the whole classism, there's racism, there's whatever ism you want to throw out there. And we tend to think, well, maybe, if the right person's in office, they'll bring down those walls. Or if such and such happens, the walls will come down. But what could bring down those walls is if the church, the body of Christ, regardless of denominational affiliation or political aspirations, the body of Christ stood together and put our faith and our trust in God to bring down those walls, to break down the walls of racism, to break down the walls that separate, the rich and the poor, and to break down all of those walls, and to redeem and rebuild lives. People who are in situations because they feel like they have nowhere else to turn. And God is standing there saying, just turn to me, because I can redeem you, I can restore your family, and I can rebuild your life. If you put your